Fracture by The Banana Has Spoken. Chapter 2. Since when were you the one in control?
Eliza, wake up.
Cold. So cold. Colder than the December wind. Than the time the electricity had been turned off for 2 months of the winter. No amount of layers kept her warm, but this chill did more than make her flesh shiver, freezing and bitter like the icy silence of a broken friendship, or so she heard. Like the empty pit of dread unknown. Something was missing. Something was wrong. It was more than a feeling, more than an inkling, as light and life returned from the pressing dark. As feeling sank into dew and dust-spattered skin, sharp as glass, a knife's edge. It was like a memory, deja vu of the worst kind, a sickness that cut to the bone.
Wake up.
Something was wrong. She needed to get up, run, hide, now. But she couldn't move, frozen, held down by a weight greater than she'd ever known, numb. Like the feeling of the cold medicine her grandmother used to make her drink when she wouldn't go to sleep. Paralyzed, an animal before a hunter, left with no other option than to face down her own death.
Wake up!
Eliza, with a gasp and a jolt, like she had been shocked, snapped her eyes open. The darkness pressed on her sight with an almost physical weight, boundless and unknowable. What had that voice been? Had there ever been one? Where was she? What happened? She'd been climbing down the hole in the mountain. She'd fallen forever, screamed until her throat was raw and passed out. Was she dead? Was this what death was? Endless darkness? She moved to sit up from... What was this around her? It felt like leaves. Autumn leaves, coated with moisture of some sort, crunching under her weight and poking at her uncomfortably. It took some effort and a little time for the dizziness to pass. She was starving. How long had she fallen? How long had she been unconscious? But she managed it, leaning on her right arm and attempting to brush some of the leaves from herself in the fathomless dark with her free hand. White-hot pain shot through her body like a bolt of lightning. Her senses careening from the numbed shock, to mystified confusion, to blinding agony in seconds. She couldn't breathe, the air forced from her body on an agonized exhaustion. She couldn't move, forced back to the ground as her right arm failed her. It was all she could do to not scream. Choking on the tears of pain flowing down her face and grasping at her clearly injured left arm, Eliza blinked beerly. Red and white lights blinking in and out against the never-ending black drop of blackness that swallowed her whole. What was that? Was she passing out again? She really hoped not. She needed to move, and fast. The feeling of wrongness that had woken her from her impromptu slumber still pressed at her, urging her to action, at the very least to escape her current whereabouts. There was something about these leaves that her subconscious did not like, and she long ago learned to trust her instincts. Blinking again to clear the glaze of persistent tears from her eyes, and attempt again to gain her bearing in this absolute dark, Eliza, belated, and with a surge of relief in the face of familiarity, finally recognized what the lights floating around her face frantically were. It was the butterflies, her friends, brushing her nose and her hair with their wings, attempting to rouse her. Ruby seemed particularly bothered, more energetic than she'd ever seen her, darting off a few feet into the dark, in the same direction each time before flying back and fluttering in tight, agitated circles. Gasping through her racking sobs on a wave of forced-back bile that threatened to overwhelm her, Eliza again attempted to sit up, forcing her body with more determination than she realized she possessed, to hold her own weight. Her head pounded from the exertion. Her eyes leaked even more tears from the sheer agony of the meager action. The butterflies throwing spots of illumination around her surroundings that she couldn't spare the concentration to investigate yet, flitted around her in discordance. But she had little mind to pay them. She needed to figure out what to do about her arm. She knew just from feeling tenderly, hesitantly, along its length that it was broken, in at least 2 places. She had broken bones before, though. They had always healed incredibly quickly, baffling her pediatricians when her grandmother had still bothered to take her. This was different, though. Somehow, something hard was sticking out of it, jagged and unnatural. It took her numb, slow thoughts a moment to realize it was the bone. The bile rose again to coat her tongue, and this time she couldn't hold it back. She vomited as far from herself as her shattered arm would allow her, whimpering and trembling in miserable agony. Her stomach heaved itself empty in moments, but rocked her body with gags and dry retches for what seemed an eternity afterwards. The pain was unreal. She hadn't ever been this injured, not in her memory. Her mind could barely grasp it. With what felt like Herculean effort, Eliza finally forced her stomach to settle and wiped infectiously at her face with her working arm's sleeve. The mucus and saliva and acid catching the bare, guttering light of the fluttering butterflies in the air around her. She resisted the shudders that shook her body at the effort, the desire she had to lay back on the ground and just go back to sleep. She needed to pull herself together. Broken arm or not, she had work to do. And sitting here shaking wasn't going to get it done. First, her bearings. She needed to get a look around her, try to get her head straight. Then her supplies. Her backpack was no longer strapped to her back. It had to be around here somewhere. After that, she'd worry about her arm and eating. Everything she needed was in that pack. From the soles she needed to make sure had survived, to another flashlight. The one that had been strapped to her head was missing as well. To food, to bandages, and an extra shirt that she could, at the very least, make a sling from. She wished she'd done more research on injuries. She knew there was something she could do to further stabilize broken limbs, but she didn't know what it was. With a heavy sigh, a wince of pain at the creak in her neck, and a rustling of the leaves around her, Eliza looked warily around her surroundings, grimacing at the pain in her arm, and squinting to try and to make anything at all stand out from the gloom. Useless. The only light came from the butterflies, now settled on her broken arm, but still flapping in obvious upset. Could they feel the wrongness too? Likely as not. And from far above, a pinprick of golden luminance in the dark, both too dim to be usable. Her stomach soured at her last observation, her neck aching as she craned her head back to gaze at the far-off entrance to the caverns her mother had described in her journal. She had said it was an incredible distance to fall, but the reality of it rang with a note of mortal horror. It was a miracle that she had only broken her arm. She could have died. Shaking her head, another wince. She needed to stop doing that. Let her neck recover first. And dismissing a momentary consideration of calling to her fire magic. That would likely not go well, considering the dry leaves surrounding her, saying nothing of the power's instability. Eliza slowly, painstakingly reached out into the darkness around her with her uninjured hand, eyes wide in the pressing dark, and bracing for the unknown. Dread and weariness, like a slush of ice, had been running through her veins ever since she'd come to, and she didn't want to encounter what was not only making her instincts go crazy, but what was setting Ruby off so badly as well. It must be bad. Perhaps a predatory animal, or something worse. She hoped for the former. Luckily, her fingers brushed over the familiar nylon of her pack's strap, only feet from where she lay, and she pulled it closer with a surge of relief flooding her drained, exhausted body. Scrambling for the zipper and smiling happily out of sheer habit, despite the gravity of her situation. That was one thing she learned, in the depths of her suffering with her so-called guardian. Things couldn't be so bad if you could smile. It was how she got through a great deal of it. Before she'd found purpose, the journal, her mission, she smiled and carried on despite it all. She liked to think her mother would have done the same. Within the pack in her searching hands were all the items she had sought, namely this jar of souls, miraculously unbroken and filled with the sleepily drifting souls she had so carefully gathered, and the extra flashlight, a large handheld affair with a sturdy handle that she immediately turned on. She took a quick look around herself with it before delving further into her pack, discovering herself to be in some sort of cavern, small enough that she could see all the walls from her position, but large enough to echo with the drips of moisture that seemed to fall perpetually from the tunnel she had descended. Dimly, she was able to make out what appeared to be murals on the rugged purplish stone of the cavern walls, too faint to make out in the darkness at this distance, with long, thick tendrils of an unknown species of ivy climbing those same walls, strung with leaves and bristling with spiny thorns. There was a sheen of several pieces of garbage littering the cave, her completely shattered forehead flashlight among them. Gods, that could have been her head. What looked like an exit to the room in one far-off corner, surrounded by cracking pillars and holding ever more impenetrable darkness. And now she knew with a long, hard look under the beam of her light what she had landed in, to not be leaves at all, but piles upon piles of moldering brownish flower petals, as deep as her forearm, and spattered in rivulets and pools with what could only be her own blood. She held back another wrench, paling at the sight of how much she had lost. No wonder she could barely see straight. Before clearing some of the crimson-splattered blooms aside and setting the flashlight on its flat end beside her, the beam shining up into the fathomlessly deep cavern entrance overhead, and digging further into her pack in search of sustenance and healing. It was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore how severely unprepared she had been for this journey, given those current circumstances. Not only had she drastically underestimated the size of the mountain and the distance down the tunnel, she hadn't even considered the possibility of becoming incapacitated, especially not this early. The reality of her narrowly avoided demise wasn't very far from her mind either, the splintered glass of her other flashlight glittering like an omen only feet away. She had little doubt that something in her magical blood had saved her from being smashed to a pulp. The dried petals wouldn't have been nearly enough to keep her alive, not after a fall like that. But that didn't feel like all that had spared her either. Grateful as she was to whatever power she had inherited from her mother, the blessed regeneration and durability she had been gifted by her birth, the foul inkling that ningled at the back of her mind was ceaseless as her butterfly companions' flutterings about her injured arm and her bowed head. There was something off about this place. She could feel it in the air, in the ground, in the petals she was surrounded by, that crunched and prodded at her with her every movement. It felt like what she had always hesitated to call magic, unsure and untaught. It certainly wasn't like the tranquility she had felt from the souls each time she had captured one, nor like the static and erratic heat of her own power, desperately being held back even though she thought of it. Nothing like the calm peace of Ruby. This felt heavy, dirty, and invasive, like it was trying to choke her, corroded and rotten, as dead as the field of flowers around her. It beckoned, almost like it knew her. Without conscious thought nor her consent, Eliza's fingers slipped from within her pack to dig into the dirt beneath her, crushing the dead golden blooms. Golden. Why had she thought that? They were brown as her drying blood, and withered leaves worming into the soil in search of what? The magic that was calling to her? That had possibly saved her on her descent? She didn't know, and the moment that she realized she was doing it, she pulled her hand back, shaking her head to clear her mind, and breathing heavily, as though she had just fought off an assailant. She needed to calm down and focus. Nothing was there. It was just the blood loss, and the shock getting to her. Steeling her will and flagging resolve, she turned back to her bag, and immediately tore open the first granola bar she found, shoving half of it into her mouth and letting the free end dangle while she chewed and sought out her roll of bandages. It was going to be fine. Things weren't going to plan, but from her experience, few things ever did. She needed to be adaptable to succeed in her endeavor, and she was glad to say that that was one of her strengths. Finally, at the very bottom of the bag, she found both the worn-out shirt and the tatty bandages she had scavenged from the disused medicine cabinet at the house, and quickly zipped her backpack up and unrolled both bunches of fabric, so she could at the very least patch herself up before hightailing it out of here. The white butterflies were a vortex of nerves, darting around her head, brushing her cheeks, and she was sure petal-strewn hair, intermittently, and Ruby herself was prodding impatiently at her hand, saying nothing of the sickness twisting in her gut the longer she stayed. Whatever the power that resided in this room was, she didn't want to.
You're not going to get very far like that.
Eliza's heart nearly leapt from her chest, fear and alarm setting her nerves and nearly her hands ablaze, and she immediately abandoned her bandages to scramble desperately for the flashlight beside her. She missed the first time, sending the light source spinning nearly out of reach. Her second attempt was tinged with pain as she jolted her limp, injured arm, trying to reach where the flashlight had landed, half buried in a pile of wilted, flaking flowers. She spun in place the moment it was in hand, forcing herself to her feet and backing away from what she thought was the source of the voice, even as she searched for it with the beam of the flashlight. Her eyes bright red in her panic. It had been tiny, sweet, and melodic, but had immediately only set her more on edge, further soured the ball of anxiety curling in her stomach.
Hello?
She called timidly into the dark, more reluctant to do so than she ever had been by anything in her life, including climbing down the hole in the mountain. And it was then, in the erratically searching path of the light in her hand, that Eliza saw something that had not been there a moment before. Someone that had not been there before. Standing in what appeared to be the exact center of the small gathering of dead flowers, at the very edge of the spray of blood that had come from her own arm, was a clearly human child, petite and as delicate as their voice had sounded only a moment before. They wore a light and dark green striped sweater and khaki shorts, a tattered-looking red scarf wrapped loosely around their neck, but no shoes, had straight auburn hair cropped neatly around their ears, and were watching her with a small smile through the eyes that glinted a stark, uncommon scarlet. It wasn't the eyes that caught her attention the most, though they set a jolt of uneasiness through her that made her head swim, her ears ring and pound. It was that tiny, almost ironic smile indented with cutely blushing cheeks and a buttoned nose. It was the way the skin around it had wreathed when the light had touched it. Eliza had never felt more repulsed by anyone than by the seemingly innocuous innocent child, their arms swinging charmingly at their sides, no more than 8 or 9 by appearance. It must just be the way they had appeared, so suddenly and without warning, that was setting her off through the dark with no visible light, completely alone. They said nothing in response to her query, only tilting their head in silence, and Eliza, the hairs on her arm and the back of her neck standing on edge, cleared her throat and slowly bent down to snag her pack under her working arm, before quickly returning to illuminate the odd child. Were they closer than they had been a second ago?
Can you help me? I broke my arm when I fell, and I need help.
She asked cautiously, not drawing a step closer to them, not with the alarm buzzing in the back of her skull, the way her familiars had landed, still as statues on her shoulders. But the child again said nothing, only turning their head to look past her, unblinking into the pressing dark all around them. The longer the silence stretched, the more her magic roiled within her flesh, ready to protect her at a moment's notice.
You shouldn't have come,
they finally said, after a long moment of unnerving quiet, just as Eliza opened her mouth to ask again, thinking they hadn't heard her. The sudden statement made the girl flinch, surprised and thrown off guard by the unexpected answer. She blinked slowly, uncomprehending, as a chill of more than foreboding ran up her spine.
What do you...
she began, her throat closing slightly in her mounting distress. But the child interrupted her, their eerily large, too shiny eyes moving back to meet hers.
The world has changed. You're not going to survive here. Not how you are now.
It took everything in her to not run right then and there. Eliza clenched her sweaty hand more tightly around her flashlight and tightened her jaw, forcing herself to stay where she was, to face down this thing.
I just need some help getting to the monsters that are supposed to be down here. Can you take me to them? At least point to me in the right direction?
The child's unnerving eyes crinkled in mirth at that, almost cruel smile splitting their porcelain face in two. A small tinkling laugh echoed through the hollow cavern oddly, as though coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Their gaze seemed to flicker to the insects cowering on her shoulders for a moment. The child's smile was smaller now, more composed, but just as cruel and as cold and sharp as their sinister laughter.
Oh, how precious. What did she tell you? To sing and dance and make them all your friends?
The chilling laugh petered out to the whisper of a giggle, tutting and punctuating with a long hiss, like a snake through grass, and Eliza backed away, step carefully and cautious.
Who are you? Why are you here?
She questioned in near accusation, racking her mind for any mention of this creature in her mother's journal, any at all. She had spoken of many monsters, hundreds of complied in the rambling pages, yet had never mentioned this being. But again, the child ignored her, taking a step forward for the one Eliza had retreated. Their mouth quirked, the scent of decay and rot permeated the air, choking her more thoroughly than her own dread. She took another step back, away from the still approaching child, now walking along the edge of the flashlight's beam.
You look like her, you know. Frisky bits. Same hair, same face, different eyes though. Different soul. The real question here is, who are you? What are you? Maybe even more. Something weird. Maybe even magic.
They said with a gleam in their eye. The closer the being got, the more sunken those shining eyes seemed, the more sallow the skin around them. And though everything within her demanded she turn tail and flee, immediately, the odd child's words, their interference in their meaning, halted Eliza's retreat, her eyes wide and her heart in her throat. Could it be? Could this creature have known Frisk? Known about the magic?
You knew my mother?
She queered in a rush, clutching at her flashlight so hard that her knuckles turned white. And the child, with a teetering laugh and a knowing, ironic look, disappeared from the light entirely, flickering for a moment before simply not being there at all. Eliza yelped at the suddenness of their disappearance, turning on the spot and looking all over the cavern for where they must have run to. No, it was magic. She knew it was magic. It had to be. Tripping over a pile of aluminum cans before finally finding them again in the dark, sitting atop a worn stone marker on the very edge of the spread of dead flowers. She'd have been willing to call the marker a gravestone if she could see it more closely.
Oh, I knew her,
the child remarked with a remarkable air of lackadaisy, kicking their legs in place.
Nice girl. Bit too nice. Got in the way of everything. But she wasn't right for the job anyway. Maybe I needed a different sort of human. Part of both worlds. You don't even know, do you? Exactly what kind of a freak are you? Poor Frisky died for nothing.
The creature's final comment was crass and cruel, and Eliza flinched, doing her very best to not drop her chin in shame. She dared not look away from the being, terrified of it moving closer to her than it already was when she wasn't watching, and at the same time, fighting back tears and angry retorts. Wasn't it enough that she had to deal with that? The knowledge that she had been the great Frisk's downfall from everyone else in her entire life? Did she really need it from this thing too? Her misery seemed to only energize the child across the room, watching the tears bead in her eyes with what appeared to be relish, and that was enough to pull her from her anguish and into fury, glaring at the being with all the determination she could muster.
Do you know why she left? What happened to separate her from her home?
She demanded, gesturing at the large to the cavern around them, and the child leaned their too sharp chin on one hand, tilting their head and tutting mockingly. Eliza clenched her sweaty hand tighter around the handle of her flashlight, the strap of her pack slipping low on her good shoulder, and perspiration, despite the chilling cold dripping from her under her hair and down her neck. This creature was infuriating.
Her bleeding heart couldn't save them forever. Only made it worse, as he got impatient, didn't he? So lonely, too empty. Idiot mocked it up worse than ever. He broke the world, broke it like mothers had. And now they're all dead inside, dust and blood, and the rest will try to eat you.
The being replied in a hypnotic sing-song voice, rocking in place atop their mock throne. Skepticism and hard-learned cynicism lowered Eliza's brows, forming her disgusted grimace. This could very well be a cruel trick from a very sadistic child, or whatever they were. She had no idea what their game was, but it wasn't beneficial to her. She was sure of that, and was wasting her time here.
Yeah, well, I don't believe you. The monsters aren't like that. Frisk said...
She began, stubbornly half turning away to look around her feet for her fallen t-shirt and bandages, but jumped in place, nearly dropping her flashlight entirely at the burst of crazed, raunchous laughter that the child let out, balled over to the ground at the foot of its former seat, in a pile of dead flower petals. They didn't make a sound as they rolled among them, didn't crush a single one, only continued to laugh so hard they cried what looked, in a shaky beam of flashlight, to be tears of black blood.
Love and compassion and hope, right? It didn't matter in the end, did it? Couldn't help it, could they? Went crazy, every last one. Ripped each other to pieces and ate each other up. Couldn't have it done it better myself.
They chortled, cackling wildly from their oddly silent bed of petals. Eliza, her blood running ever colder, stilled where she stood, the fear and pain and blood loss and sickness and cold all colliding in her mind to form a perfect storm of confusion and erratic mania. So discordant that she didn't know which voice was hers, which was the being's laughing uproariously across the room. Her butterfly companions, disturbed by her motion to retrieve her makeshift bandages, seemed to be echoing the urging of whatever instinct lived deep inside her. Ruby, dodging away from both her and the child, to flit indicatively towards the tall archway in the shadow to the east. But another voice was tearing at her psyche, wearing away at her already fragile mental state, and it wasn't nearly as pleasant as the whispering wind that cooled and soothed her anguished mind. It was the hacking, carrying, nearly too ecstatic laughter of the being staring upside down and wide-eyed at her from the ground. Their words were doing something to her brain, fuzzing and confusing her, distorting everything and turning the edges of her vision black and numbing her tongue, the tips of her fingers. She shook her head to restore the feeling to it as she took a wary step back towards the exit, her legs and mind feeling sluggish.
That's not possible,
she insisted doggedly, not wanting to look at them any longer.
More than possible. And it's understandable, isn't it? They just got hungry.
They teetered, something hard and meaningful in the final word they spoke, and as they said it, the cavern around her ceased to be. About her feet was a bloodbath, a city in flames, soaked in blood and dust. A fiendish demon tearing monsters apart and screeching at a sunset of fire. Parents consuming their own children, feasting on their own flesh only to come to their senses and destroy themselves in suicide. Sickening hedonism, traps made of the bones of fallen victims, graves opened only to be consumed, and above it all, the sounds of screams unending, the death of tens of thousands of the weak to feed the strong, the screams of the innocent consumed alive before their time. Her screams as she choked on her own vomit and tears spilled again over the browned and blackened flower petals at her feet.
Tragic, isn't it?
Eliza nearly slipped and fell in the pool of vomit she had just gagged up before her, as she scrambled away from the voice beside her ear so quickly. her heart in her throat, and her eyes scarlet wide in an attempt to clear both the nightmare vision and the tears from her gaze. Her vision was spotty, adjusting again to the gloom. But there, only inches from where she had stood only moments before, was the child, grinning ear to ear like a badly painted doll. It had no eyes, the nightmare vision, and when it smiled, maggots had dripped from its empty mouth. Its skin was slime, dripping from its yellowed bones, and within its rotten husk resided a shadow deeper than the blackest night she had ever known. Eliza screamed again, her butterflies in a flurry around her, and her hands, smoking, almost set ablaze in her distress. She couldn't run, and the child's voice was in her head.
What did I tell you? What do you think of them now? It's nothing but the truth, you know. I have no reason to lie.
The teenager choked on a haggard cry, the voice trying to press those images again into her mind. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. It couldn't all be lost already.
How did this happen? Why?
She sobbed, and the creature, with a glint in their eyes that looked far too much like longing to be innocence, followed her retreat, reaching out with a hand far less than human to brush her tear from her cheek. Fox in their caring, but insistent in their pressing corrosion. Eliza shuddered, but couldn't move to pull away.
It's who they are, Eliza. They're monsters. It's in the design. Abominations now one and all. Sad though, isn't it? That they're all insane, made to do whatever it takes to survive. Kill or be killed. All because of one stupid little flower.
Their words were a sour vine clinging and choking, stealing away fact and reason, and leaving behind the fear they had instilled in her. She struggled, her gaze following with horror a short, fat maggot that crawled from their eye socket and down their nose. But even that couldn't break her from the haze the vision had put over her mind. The paralyzing toxin of fear that sank into her blood with each pump of her heart. Only the gentle whisper at the back of her mind, stalwart and steady, held true, and at long last did she hear its voice, silvery and calm as the moon's glow.
You never told them your name, Starlight. How do they know your name?
She was too far gone. She must have said her name. It wasn't outrageous to assume such a small detail.
It's sad.
And it was. She didn't want this to happen to them. She had wanted to help them as much as Frisk had. That's what she had come here for. When had the creature gotten so close to her face? She didn't even flinch, her head swaying slowly as the numbness that had threatened the tips of her fingers, her toes, crept up her arms and legs, stealing away her sense of self. She was losing awareness of everything around her. She couldn't feel the cool of the air anymore. The pain in her head, her stomach, her arm was distant, foreign. Even the smell of death was fading away, almost unnoticeable, despite the being hovering inches from her nose. A blur of red fluttered between their faces, attacking the being's awful-filled nasal cavity. But it was gone in a flash of fingers and a soft squeal of pain.
We could help them, you and me. We could show them mercy, couldn't we? Save them from this world, the unfairness of their fate.
The creature touched her arm, and in a flash of absolute black, Eliza felt nothing. Blissful nothingness. No pain, no fear, no self-hatred. The thoughts of her worthless life abated for the first time in years. It was so peaceful. She felt strong, like a big cup had fallen over her weakness, while another had scooped up a power deep inside her soul, flooding her body with warmth. The presence, once sour, but now so strong and wonderful, surrounded her. It would save them. It promised. All she had to do was surrender.
We could.
Eliza had the faint feeling of her arm being caressed, and blinked when she saw a hand held in front of her face. Like a handshake, a partnership. Take it. Yes. Do it. Finally.
Take my hand and together we can make it all right again.
Stop!
Eliza's mind shook away from the numbness minutely, drunk on the fog of whatever it was that was happening, just enough to hear the silvery voice again. It was clamoring for her attention, shouting for it, in fact. She could barely pay attention. Her eyes were already starting to close. She was so tired. She just needed to make this deal. Chara would take care of the rest. Who was Chara?
Do you see what they do? They invade the mind, steal control and manipulate however they can to do their will. They weren't always like this. It didn't have to be this way, and has only gotten worse. But you cannot go with them, my light. You must go, now.
Eliza blinked, stirred by the voice. That couldn't be right. This being had been her friend.
Remember what they truly look like, Eliza. Remember how they move, how they speak, but most of all, their motives. How they spoke of the monsters and your family. They are not your friend. Magic can be kind, but this magic is not. Break free, precious, quickly!
The voice was right. The creature hadn't wanted to help her. It wanted something else. She could feel the twisted wrongness in its mien, the poison in its intent. And with all her might, with a surge of her soul and the strongest flare of fire that she could summon, Eliza pushed back and away from the being that had her in its rotten grasp.
No!
She screamed, her voice hoarse from her sobs and her fingers tingling from the dismissal of the numbness. Her limp arm was in agony of pain again, razors of anguish running down her entire left side. But she didn't linger to see what effect her fireball nor her scream did to the creature, turning tail and running headlong into the dark. The white butterflies awaited her beside the cracked arches that led out of the enormous cavern, fluttering like mad about a sign that she couldn't understand in the guttering light of her flashlight. And on the floor, beside one of the crenellated columns, lay Ruby, one of her wings bent at the tip. Laughter, mad, cackling laughter, echoed behind her. But Eliza wasn't about to abandon her oldest friend. She stuffed her flashlight under her arm, bent to scoop up the flailing, reaching insect into her hand, and ran on into the unknown. Chara watched the strange girl disappear into the shadows and casually stretched their apparition's arms over their head lazily. A new game after so long, it deserved a new flair, and they knew the perfect addition. It didn't matter that they'd gotten the inspiration from Eliza herself. They thought with a wicked grin and a snide snicker. Plagiarism was a weak term for ingenuity, after all. The stubby fingers clawed at their cheeks, the rotting skin easily sloughing off, blood and blackened, clotting tar oozing around exposed teeth, that they ran the rotting cyst-covered tongue over with relish. Holding out their hand, the wriggling flesh within slipped from their grasp and into the air, following after their new playmate. Chara couldn't help but giggle in glee, clapping their gore-covered hands together and skipping back to their headstone, kicking dead petals covered in vomit and blood as they went into the air. Oh, they were very excited to be playing again, and couldn't wait to see how this pawn played along.